All right, hello from my dining room. Hello not only from me, but also from the contractors who are making banging noises on the outside of my house today, and from my upstairs neighbors who exclusively wear combat boots indoors. We all send you our best in this day of social distancing. I have a couple of things I want to tell you today about Chinese society, um, and particularly key social cleavages in China. And I want to start you off with this image from the opening ceremony of the 2008 Beijing Olympics. I highly, highly encourage you to watch the pageantry part of that opening ceremony before you get to the Parade of Nations bit. There's a link on the Google site for distance learning in this course. The entire thing is a remarkable summary of both kind of how China sees its history and its culture and wants to present itself to the world, and also just the tremendous degree to which China can coordinate people to do 2008 people do stuff at the same time. Later, I hope that we'll watch the London 2012 opening ceremony, and you'll see how a democratic society with a lot of civil liberties is just way, way less good at getting people to dance in coordination with each other. Um, but I wanted to isolate this particular image because what it shows you, zoomed in a little bit, is what's supposed to be children from each of China's 55 recognized ethnic minority groups, all wearing their sort of traditional costume or traditional dress, hand in hand, carrying out the Chinese national flag to be raised at the Olympic opening ceremony. This is, of course, a moment freighted with a ton of symbolism, and it's supposed to convey the message that all of these groups kind of live together in harmony, and that, united as one, they are all strengthening the great Chinese nation, which should not be entirely, unfamiliar if you've paid any attention to the way that Americans present themselves on the international stage. A trick is that number one, these 55 ethnic minority groups together make up something like 8% of China's population. And number two, most or all of the children that came out as representatives of the ethnic minority groups on the stage at the Olympics were actually from the majority group of Han Chinese people, selected for their acting skills and their photogenic nature, as opposed to, actually being the people that they're dressed up as. That, I think, encapsulates a lot about China's approach to its ethnic minorities, which I'll talk about for a moment today. Three big social cleavages you want to know about in China: ethnicity, language, region. Number one, ethnicity. As I've just been saying, the overwhelming majority of Chinese people ethnically identify as Han Chinese. They constitute 92% of the population. There are 55 minority groups that are officially recognized in the laws of the Chinese state. There are a number of other groups of people who claim to be ethnically distinctive from the Han people, but aren't legally recognized, meaning that they're not entitled to the same degree of protection for cultural autonomy and representation. Um, Second cleavage you need to know about is language. The most widely spoken language in China is called Mandarin Chinese. That's the official language of government. That's the official language of most of China's higher education system. But China is a vast country, and it took a tremendous effort, primarily under Mao Zedong's government, to make Mandarin more widely spoken, and particularly to make it more widely written. So there are many, many, many other spoken languages and dialects, meaning sort of variations on or things that are linguistically similar to Mandarin Chinese. Cantonese, the second most widely spoken language in China, is my father's first language. And it can be written the same as Mandarin Chinese, although there's two different sets of written characters in Chinese. But when it's spoken, they're mutually unintelligible. Being a Mandarin speaker does not give you any particular access to understand spoken Cantonese. I'll put a supplemental optional video on the website about the kind of social impact of being unable to speak Mandarin if I can find it. But having a good, fluent, or a common complement in China is standard Mandarin, is often a way to make yourself sort of more marketable for employers and for educational institutions. Finally, the geographic cleavage in China, most importantly, is the urban-rural cleavage. China's urban population has been growing just tremendously as China has industrialized in the last few decades. And there is a significant, reinforcing cleavage between geography and socioeconomic class and social status. On average, people who live in the cities are wealthier, they are more educated than people who live in rural areas. China has made tremendous strides in reducing just absolute numbers of people living in poverty over the last several decades. But to the remaining and significant population of people living in poverty in China is mostly concentrated in the countryside. Speaking of reinforcing social cleavages, let's take a look at a couple of pieces of information about the geographic distribution of China's ethnic minorities. What this map is showing you is the percentage of Han Chinese people in the population of each of China's provinces. And the places that you want to be able to point out with a particularly low concentration of Han Chinese people are Tibet, which the Chinese state refers to as Xizang in the west, and then Xinjiang in the northwest. In Xinjiang, there's a concentration of what's called the Uyghur population, which is an ethnic minority and predominantly Muslim group. In Tibet, the predominant ethnic group is Tibetan, and the predominant religion is Buddhist. Um, as a consequence, this fuzzy map shows you that the Chinese state has responded to those, overlapping cleavages by creating a couple of subnational units, which have significantly more autonomy, at least on paper, than most of China's provinces. It's really important to remember that China is a unitary system; it's not a federal system, and so those provinces, those different rights can be taken away at any time. And of course, as is always the case in China, it's going to work different in practice than it looks on paper. But this is, at least on paper, a concession that the Chinese state has made to ethnic diversity. Um, there are 5 such autonomous regions, and as I said a minute ago, the ones we're going to talk the most about in this course, the most politically prominent ones, are Xinjiang in the northwest, where the population is ethnically Uyghur and religiously mostly Muslim, and Xizang are more commonly in the west, Tibet in the sort of west or southwest of the country. Um, those provinces are legally, in China's constitution, entitled to more independence, to more cultural autonomy in particular, and to have specifically guaranteed representation in the state mechanisms of China's government. And I want to emphasize that that's true on the state side and the party side. So, as an illustration of that, here is what most delegates to China's National People's Congress look like. You'll want to remember that the NPC, the National People's Congress, is formally, constitutionally, legally the highest governing body in China. It meets once every 5 years. It has more than 2,000 delegates. And most of its delegates look pretty identical in that they are wearing black suits if they're not wearing army uniforms. However, once in a while, Chinese state media will release a picture from the National People's Congress session where you have somebody in distinctively ethnic dress sticking out very prominently in the middle of a room of people who are mostly wearing, dark Western suits. They do that very conscientiously to underscore what is, true in fact, which is that members of those recognized ethnic minorities do have guaranteed representation in some pieces um, the state side of China's government mechanisms. And so, for instance, you see representatives of the official ethnic minority groups in the National People's Congress every 5 years. However, it's really important to note that there are no such similar structures for guaranteeing minority representation on the party side of China's institutions, of China's organizational parallelism. And so you might be able to draw some well supported conclusions about whether this representation for minorities is more about actually sharing power and granting autonomy, or whether it's more about trying to establish a veneer of legitimacy.